Okay, let's dive in. Today, we're grappling with a set of sources that takes us on a deep exploration of what's described as changing traditions and the idea of the three orders in European history.
Hmm.
We're focusing primarily on a huge sweep of time, roughly from the ninth all the way up to the 17th century. But these materials also smartly pull in context from 1300 to 1700 across the globe, reminding us that Europe's story wasn't happening in a vacuum.
Yeah, it's easy to fall into a stereotype, isn't it? Medieval Europe as this static, unchanging world of castles and, unchanging customs.
Exactly.
But these sources absolutely shatter that idea. They offer a profound look at the very foundations of that society, its structures, its power dynamics, and the relentless pressures that kept changing it, often in ways people living through it couldn't predict.
Right. So our mission in this deep dive is to unpack the core ideas these sources present. We
Yeah.
want to understand this concept of the three orders that supposedly defined medieval life:
Yeah.
the prayers, the fighters, and the
The
workers.
classic trio.
But more importantly, we want to dig into the forces that fundamentally challenged and reshaped those traditions. And then, crucial to the source's perspective, we'll zoom out to see how Europe was connecting with, learning from, and impacting the rest of the world during this transformative period.
And for you, our listener, who follows and knows this history, we aim to give you a shortcut, not just to the facts, but to the insights. To uncover some surprising details, understand the complex layers of power, and see the unexpected ways that change unfolded, proving this era was anything but static.
Think of it as getting the core synthesis without having to read the stack yourself.
Precisely. A curated tour, if you will.
Let's set the scene then. The sources wisely don't start with a narrow focus on Europe. They begin by giving us that broader world context, especially around the ninth century. What picture did they paint of the world at large?
Well, what the material highlights is that by the ninth century, enormous, sophisticated empires were already thriving across Asia. You had the legacy of the Roman Empire in the east, powerful Arab empires stretching across North Africa and into Spain, and later, the vast Mongol Empire.
Huge territories.
Immense. These weren't just regional powers, they were built on sprawling cities, intricate trade networks that spanned continents, and in some cases, like the Mongols, incredibly effective organization of nomadic peoples across immense territories.
And one of the key observations the source makes about these empires is how they brought about cultural encounters and change.
Right. And that change might seem slow in historical retrospect, but for individuals or communities suddenly incorporated into a larger empire, it would have been experienced very abruptly. A real shock.
It's that tension between the long arc of history and the sharp shock of personal experience.
Exactly. Now, juxtapose that with Western Europe during this same broad time frame from the ninth to the 17th centuries.
Mm.
The sources emphasize that European traditions underwent profound changes.
What kind of changes are we talking about? Is it just politics or?
Oh, it's much broader. The material points to several areas. There was a palpable shift in how knowledge was pursued, moving towards scientific investigation based on experiment rather than solely relying on religious belief or classical authority.
So a move towards empiricism.
In a way, yes, a growing emphasis on observation. Plus, there was serious intellectual engagement with the organization of government, leading over centuries to the development of more formal civil services, the emergence and strengthening of parliaments, and the codification of laws.
And technology wasn't left behind. The sources mention improvements being applied in industry and agriculture.
Definitely. And here's a critical point the material underscores. The consequences of these European changes weren't confined to Europe. They were felt powerfully outside of it, shaping global interactions.
That's a really important perspective to keep in mind.
It is. To understand Western and Central Europe specifically after the fragmentation of the Western Roman Empire, the sources explain it didn't just collapse cleanly, it was a slow disintegration.
Not like flipping a switch.
Not at all. The incoming tribes and kingdoms often adapted existing Roman administrative structures rather than wiping the slate clean. But, importantly, urban centers in Western Europe were considerably smaller than the great cities of the Byzantine Empire or the Arab world during this period.
So not the sprawling metropolises you'd find elsewhere.
Generally, no, but significant developments were happening, especially in the countryside, from the ninth to the 11th centuries.
Okay, what was key there?
This is where the concept of feudalism becomes central. After the rise and fall of Charlemagne's empire, what historians term feudalism began to consolidate in Western and Central Europe.
Feudalism. It's a term everyone knows, but What does it actually mean according to these sources?
Well, the sources describe it as a complex web of economic, legal, political, and social relationships that grew out of a blend of remaining Roman institutions and the customs of the Germanic tribes. The very word feudalism comes from feud, meaning a piece of land in German, which tells you a lot about its foundation.
It sounds like land was everything.
It really was the basis of power in the economy. At its core, the system revolved around agricultural production, centered on fortified structures like castles and manor houses.
Okay. And who held the power in this system? What was the basic setup?
The fundamental relationship described is that lords owned the land, and the people who cultivated it were primarily peasants, many of whom were serfs.
Serfs.
Oh.
So not entirely free.
Often very much not free. Peasants gave loyalty, labor, and produce to the lord in exchange for protection, a crucial need in unsettled times.
And the lords, were they kings, or was there another layer?
Usually another layer or several layers. The lords themselves were part of a hierarchy. They were vassals of kings or higher-ranking lords, pledging loyalty and military service in return for control over the land.
So like a pyramid structure.
You could think of it that way, yeah. A system of cascading obligations, from the king down to the humblest peasant tied to the soil.
And woven through all of this was the immense influence of the Catholic Church.
Absolutely critical. The sources stress the church's central role. It wasn't just a spiritual guide, it was a major political and economic power.
How so?
Well, it supported the monarchy, but it also owned vast amounts of land, sometimes more than powerful nobles, had its own legal system, canon law, and could levy taxes, like the tithe.
The tithe. That was the 10%.
Exactly. 1/10 of people's produce or income. This gave it significant wealth and a degree of independence from secular rulers.
So the church was operating almost like another layer of feudal power.
In many ways, yes. The sources point out how church ceremonies even adopted elements of feudal customs, kneeling, bowing, pledging loyalty, much like a knight to his lord. This ritual blending reinforced the idea that the social order, including its inequalities, was divinely ordained.
That's fascinating. It blends the sacred and the secular.
It really does. The church provided spiritual comfort in a difficult world and encouraged devotion, leading to institutions like monasteries where people could dedicate themselves fully to God.
And monasteries weren't just places of isolated worship, were they? The sources suggest they had other roles.
Far from it. The sources note that monasteries and churches across Europe formed a crucial network of scholarship. And importantly, this network had contact with the more advanced civilizations to the east, the Muslim states of Spain and the Byzantine Empire.
So they were conduits for knowledge.
Absolutely. This contact was a vital conduit for knowledge and culture from the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond to reach Europe. Think philosophy, science, medicine.
Which also facilitated trade, didn't it? The sources mentioned places like Venice and Genoa.
Exactly. The growth of these early European urban centers like Venice, Genoa, but also others like Pisa, were strongly linked to developing trading relationships with those same Muslim states and the Byzantine Empire.
What drew them?
European merchants were drawn by the wealth and goods available. Spices, silks, advanced crafts, and sometimes even pilgrimage sites in those regions spurred travel and trade.
And the Crusades, often seen purely as military conflicts, also acted as spurs for trade across the Mediterranean.
Yes, they certainly did. An unintended consequence, perhaps, but a significant one. An inland trade developed too, facilitated by large fairs and connected by the important port cities of the Baltic and North Sea.
So while the foundation was land and loyalty in the countryside, there was this growing element of connection and commerce beginning to take root.
Definitely, a dynamic tension starting to build.
And all of this feeds into the dominant social model of the time, or at least how society idealized itself. The concept of the three orders.
This concept is key to understanding the mindset of the period as presented in the sources. It was largely a French concept, categorizing society based on function or work.
The three orders were
The priests, those who prayed, the land-owning nobles, those who fought, and the peasants, those who worked. Orators, bellators, laborators in Latin.
It sounds very neat and tidy, almost like everyone had their assigned place.
That was the idea, the ideology. And to justify this inherent inequality, the sources bring in a powerful quote attributed to Abbess Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century.
What did she say?
It essentially boils down to the belief that God created distinct ranks among humans. Therefore, there could be no equality on earth. Equality was only possible in heaven. This ideology provided a religious underpinning for the existing social hierarchy.
That's a powerful justification for the status quo.
Immensely powerful.
Let's break down each order, starting with the second order, the nobility, the fighters, bellators.
Right. The nobility were theoretically not involved in religious rituals like the clergy, but their power was immense and very tangible. Their position was rooted in land ownership and maintained through the system of vassalage we mentioned.
Which meant they owed service to a higher lord or king.
Precisely. Drawing on traditions from groups like the Franks and Germans, the king or a powerful lord, the seigneur, would grant land to vassals who were typically big landowners. These vassals, in turn, could have their own vassals.
And this wasn't just a handshake agreement. The sources describe a significant ritual involved.
Oh, it was a very formal, binding act. Oaths were sworn, often dramatically on the Bible or holy relics. Charters were drawn up as legal proof. Sometimes, symbols of earth, like a clod of soil or a twig, were exchanged to represent the land grant.
A symbolic transfer.
Exactly. It was a mutual promise. Service and loyalty from the vassal, protection and support from the lord, meant to be unbreakable.
And this position as a noble came with significant privileges, didn't it?
Absolutely. A noble had considerable autonomy over their property. They could raise their own feudal levies, essentially private forces of knights and armed men loyal to them, not directly to the king.
That's a powerful source of independent strength. Potentially a challenge to the king, even.
It certainly was, and often led to conflict. Their power wasn't just military. Nobles also held judicial authority. They ran courts on their estates, administered justice, decided disputes, and in some areas could even coin their own money, acting almost like mini-sovereigns within their territory.
Wow, real local power.
Very real, and their wealth and power were fundamentally tied to the manorial estate.
Tell us about the manor. What was that like?
The manorial estate was the economic engine of the nobility. This was the lord's own domain, his manor house, and the lands directly under his control. But it encompassed the entire village community living on that land.
So the village was part of the estate?
Yes. The sources note that even a relatively small estate might support 50 or 60 families, while larger ones could be much bigger, with hundreds of villagers or peasants tied to the lord's control.
And these estates were designed to be largely self-sufficient, trying to produce everything they needed.
Yes, that was the aim, largely out of necessity. The sources paint a picture of almost everything needed for daily life being produced or available on the estate. Grain was grown in the fields. Craftspeople like blacksmiths, carpenters, and stonemasons maintained the infrastructure. Women spun and wove cloth.
What about resources?
The estate included vital resources like extensive woodlands for timber and hunting and pasture for livestock, all controlled by the lord. Access to these was crucial.
So the nobility, the second order, controlled the land, wielded military and judicial power, and extracted wealth from the labor of the third order.
In a nutshell, yes. That's the core of their position.
Okay, now let's move to the first order. The clergy, the orators.
Described as the first order, seen as the spiritual guides. And their structure mirrored, in its own way, the hierarchy of secular power. The Pope in Rome was the head of the Western Church.
At the top.
Right, with a hierarchy running down through archbishops, bishops, and local priests serving individual parishes.
And their power, like the nobilities, was based on more than just influence, as you mentioned, with the tithes and land ownership.
Crucially, the church owned vast amounts of land itself. It had its own legal system, the canon law, and could levy taxes independently of the king. The tithe was the most significant, yes, 1/10 of all agricultural produce or income, payable by everyone.
That wealth must have been enormous.
It was. It funded the church's activities, supported the clergy bishops, often lived like nobles, and paid for services like commemorating the dead, building churches, charity.
It really highlights their independence from secular rulers.
It does. And as we mentioned, the sources point out how church ceremonies incorporated feudal elements, integrating religious practice deeply into the social structure, almost sacralizing the feudal bonds, giving it divine legitimacy.
Beyond the parish priests living in the world, the monastic life was a significant part of the clergy.
A very significant part. Monasteries offered a path for intense religious devotion, often lived communally in isolation from the day-to-day secular world. Early examples included the rule of Saint Benedict from the 6th century and the influential monastery at Cluny in Burgundy, founded around 910.
What was life like inside a monastery?
These communities, typically numbering 10-20 initially but growing larger, structured their lives around a strict routine of work, worship, and prayer. Ora et labora, pray and work. They were open to both men and women, though in separate communities, monasteries and nunneries or convents, and members took vows of celibacy, poverty, and obedience to their abbot or abbess.
And their contribution went beyond just spiritual devotion, didn't it? You mentioned scholarship earlier.
Absolutely. Monasteries were vital centers of learning, painstakingly copying manuscripts by hand, preserving knowledge both classical and Christian, and developing libraries. This was crucial before the printing press.
So they were like the universities of their day, in a way.
In some respects, yes. They were also patrons of art and architecture. They played a key role in agriculture, clearing land and developing farming techniques. And they provided crucial charity, running schools and hospitals at a time when state infrastructure for this didn't exist.
Any famous examples?
The sources mention figures like Abbess Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century as a remarkable example, not just an abbess, but a renowned composer, writer, visionary, and mystic. A polymath.
And back in the villages, the parish church was the heart of the community, wasn't it?
Absolutely essential. The parish church was the center of village life. The priest guided the community's spiritual life, performed baptisms, marriages, funerals, and major Christian holidays like Christmas and Easter were the central events of the year, marking significant social gatherings and breaks from work.
That term holy days, becoming holidays, perfectly captures their dual function.
It really does. Part religious observance, part community celebration and rest.
And for some, devotion meant undertaking journeys, pilgrimages.
Pilgrimage was a very important expression of faith, long, often arduous journeys to venerated shrines like Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Canterbury in England, or Rome itself, or even Jerusalem.
Why did people go?
The sources evoke this with the famous opening lines of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, capturing the human desire in the spring to undertake these journeys to fern hallways, to foreign shrines. It was a mix, perhaps, of piety, seeking forgiveness for sins, hoping for miracles or cures, fulfilling a vow, or maybe even a bit of adventure in seeing the world.
So we have the nobility and the clergy, the first two orders, holding power and land, supported by the labor of the third order, the peasants.
The laborator.
The third order, those who served by working the land, the vast majority of the population. The sources make it clear that within this group of cultivators there were distinctions, free peasants and serfs. Let's clarify the difference. What did it mean to be a free peasant?
Free peasants held their own farms, sometimes renting land from the lord. Critically, they weren't permanently tied to the manor and had some legal rights, like appearing in royal courts. They even had military obligations to the king, serving maybe up to 40 days a year.
But they still owed things to the local lord.
Oh yes, even free peasants owed significant services to the lord of the manor, regularly laboring on the lord's domain, his private fields, often several days a week. This labor rent was direct work on the lord's fields, a fundamental part of the economic system. It was how the lord got his own lands cultivated.
So not entirely free from obligations to the lord, even if legally distinct from serfs.
Exactly. They performed a range of tasks: plowing, sowing, harvesting the lord's crops, gathering firewood, helping with building and repairs on the manor, even tasks like making cloth or candles or pressing grapes for the lord's wine.
What about taxes?
While the clergy and nobility were largely exempt from royal taxes, these services and rents owed by peasants effectively served as a form of taxation by the lord. It was a heavy burden.
And serfs had even fewer rights and more obligations. How are they different?
Serfs were legally tied to the land they cultivated, which belonged to the lord. They couldn't leave the manor without the lord's permission. They had to give a significantly larger share of their produce to the lord compared to free peasants.
So very restricted movement.
Extremely. The lord also exercised significant monopolies over serfs. They had to use the lord's mill to grind their grain, his oven to bake their bread, and his wine press, paying fees for each use. This generated extra income for the lord.
And even personal life was controlled.
To a large extent, serfs often needed the lord's consent and usually had to pay a fee, called a marchet, to marry someone, especially someone from outside the manor. The lord could even choose their spouse in some cases.
That sounds incredibly restrictive, tying almost every aspect of their life to the lord's control.
It was a system of profound dependency and limited freedom. The sources bring this back to England specifically after the Norman conquest in 1066.
How did the conquest affect this?
William the Conqueror distributed land to about 180 Norman nobles who brought their own knights. These nobles were obligated to supply soldiers to the king. Importantly, the existing Anglo-Saxon peasants on these lands were often explicitly forbidden from seeking different lords, effectively limiting their mobility and solidifying a more standardized, restricted status for many, blurring the lines perhaps between traditional free status and serfdom across the country. It tightened the system.
So this three orders model, underpinned by the structures of feudalism and manorialism, was the established framework. It seems rigid, almost set in stone. But the sources make it clear this system wasn't static. It was constantly being challenged and transformed.
That's a crucial point the sources emphasize. While it was the dominant ideology and structure for centuries, it was never frozen. Major forces of change were constantly at play, including environmental shifts, developments in land use and agricultural technology, and new social and economic forces emerging. It was always evolving, even if slowly at times.
Let's start with the environment. The sources mention a contrast between the early medieval period and later centuries. How did climate affect things?
In the early medieval period, say from the 5th to the 10th century, Europe was still heavily forested. Much less land was available for intensive agriculture, limiting the population size the land could support. Conditions were often cooler and wetter, too.
But things warmed up.
Yes, starting significantly in the 11th century, Europe entered a prolonged warmer phase, sometimes called the medieval warm period. This more favorable climate directly impacted agriculture. It allowed cultivation to expand into areas previously unsuitable, like higher altitudes or northern regions.
And people took advantage of that.
Definitely. Peasants, often pushed or incentivized by lords looking to increase their income from rents and surplus, cleared vast swaths of forest to bring more land under the plow. This was a huge internal expansion.
However, it wasn't a continuous warm period, was it? Things changed again later.
No, the sources also point to the later period, roughly starting in the 14th century, sometimes called the Little Ice Age, which brought colder, longer winters and shorter, wetter summers, particularly impacting northern Europe. This made agriculture much more challenging again and reduced yields significantly. Environmental factors were clearly a fundamental, sometimes disruptive force.
Climate wasn't stable, and the technology used in agriculture itself was a major limitation early on, you mentioned.
Hugely limiting. Before the 11th century, agricultural technology was quite basic. The primary plow was wooden, lightweight, and lacked a mold board to turn the soil over properly.
What did that mean in practice?
It essentially just scratched the surface, making it inefficient for deeper, richer soils or heavier clay soils. It required a huge team of 6 stele oxen, which were slow and expensive to keep. And the sources give this incredible detail. Plowing a large field using these methods could take up to 4 years to complete. Imagine that.
4 years. Productivity must have been incredibly low.
Inherently very low. Natural fertility was quickly exhausted.
And the way land was used, the two-field system, sounds incredibly inefficient today. You mentioned that earlier.
It was. One field would be planted with a winter crop, typically wheat or rye, and the other would be left fallow unplanted for a year to recover nutrients. This meant half of the precious, cleared, arable land was unproductive every single year. It was a necessary evil given the lack of fertilization and poor plowing technology, but massively wasteful of land.
So the agricultural innovations that arrived from the 11th century onwards must have been revolutionary. What changed?
They truly were game changers. The introduction of heavy, iron-tipped plows fitted with mold boards was huge. These could dig deeper and crucially turn the soil over, burying weeds, improving drainage, and bringing buried nutrients to the surface.
Did that require different power?
Yes, and that leads to the next innovation. Animal power became more effective. The invention of the shoulder harness for horses was key. The old neck harness used for oxen constricted horses' windpipes if they pulled heavy loads, limiting their power.
So the harness made the difference.
Exactly. The shoulder harness allowed horses to pull much more effectively using their full strength. Horses were faster and had more stamina than oxen, meaning more land could be plowed more quickly.
But were horses common?
They became more common, yes, although keeping horses was more expensive as they needed oats rather than just pasture, and required metal horseshoes, which were costly. So it wasn't an overnight switch everywhere, but a gradual, significant shift.
And what about mechanical power?
Wind and water mills became increasingly common across Europe, especially from the 11th century. They mechanized tasks like grinding grain into flour and pressing olives or grapes for oil and wine. This freed up significant human and animal labor that was previously done manually, often by women, or using inefficient hand corns.
But the most impactful change in land use was the three-field system, right?
Yeah.
How did that work?
This was truly transformative for much of Europe, particularly in the north. Instead of dividing arable land into two, it was split into three sections.
Okay.
In year one field was planted with an autumn crop, like wheat or rye for bread. In year two, the second field received a spring crop, such as peas, beans, lentils, or oats and barley for animal feed and ale. And only the third field was left fallow to recover.
So you're farming 2/3 of the land each year instead of half.
Exactly. A massive increase in productive land straight away. And you were getting two harvests instead of one, a winter grain harvest and a spring harvest. Plus, planting legumes like peas and beans was brilliant because they naturally fix nitrogen in the soil, actually restoring fertility, which benefited the next grain crop.
Wow. Better yields and soil health.
Precisely. The sources note that this led to a significant increase in overall food production, in some areas perhaps even doubling grain output per family holding over time.
And this had a massive impact on people's lives, surely. More food.
A huge impact. The increase in food quantity and, importantly, quality, particularly the introduction of more protein-rich crops like peas and beans into the diet, led to better nutrition.
Which means?
This contributed directly to population growth and probably longer lifespans. The sources mention that between roughly 1000 and 1300, Europe's population grew dramatically, maybe from around 42 million to 73 million. An average life expectancy by the 13th century was perhaps 10 years longer than in the 8th century, a remarkable demographic change fueled by food.
And that growing population couldn't all stay on the land, even with improved farming. This fueled another major force of change, the rise of towns and townspeople from the 11th century onwards.
This was a direct consequence of the agricultural revolution and the population boom. As farming became more efficient and produced a surplus, fewer people were needed just to farm, freeing them up or forcing them off overcrowded land to pursue other skills and activities.
And towns offered a completely different life from the manor, didn't they?
Absolutely. Towns became centers of trade, specialized crafts, and commerce. They offered an escape from the rigid legal and economic ties of the manorial system, a different world.
Leading to that powerful saying, Stadtluft macht frei, town air makes free.
It was more than just a saying. It reflected a legal reality noted in the sources, particularly in German lands, but elsewhere too. A serf who successfully escaped the manor and lived openly in a town for a year and a day without being reclaimed by their lord could legally gain their freedom.
Yeah, must have been a huge incentive.
A massive draw. It made towns magnets for ambitious or desperate peasants seeking a new life and opportunity away from the lord's control.
Towns weren't just agricultural communities that got bigger, they were hubs of different skills, needing specialized labor.
Exactly. They grew rapidly, some reaching populations of 30,000 or more by the 13th or 14th century, places like London, Paris, Florence, Ghent. They required specialized skills beyond farming: bankers, lawyers, merchants, weavers, brewers, butchers, metal workers, builders, a whole ecosystem of crafts and services.
And these craftspeople organized themselves into guilds. What were those?
Guilds were incredibly important institutions in urban life. They were associations of people in the same trade, or craft bakers, weavers, goldsmiths, etc. They regulated almost everything.
Like what?
From the quality of goods produced and the training of apprentices, a long process in itself, to setting prices and controlling who could sell what in the town. They often had strict rules, formal structures, halls, patron saints, and played a central role in the social, political, and economic life of the town. They provided a framework for urban work.
And this urban growth spurred further trade, presumably, connecting these towns.
Definitely. New trade routes developed and old ones expanded, connecting Europe more strongly internally and externally, linking the Mediterranean world with Northern Europe, connecting to West Asia via Italian cities, and facilitating trade across the North Sea and Baltic.
What kinds of goods were moving?
Merchants from England traded wool and later cloth, tin. The French traded wine and salt. Flanders was famous for high-quality textiles. Italian cities traded luxury goods from the east. The Hanseatic League dominated Baltic trade in grain, timber, furs, fish. As trade grew, so did the movement of people, with craftsmen traveling to where their skills were needed or markets were lucrative.
So the rise of towns wasn't just an economic shift, it was a social and political one, creating a new power base outside the traditional land-based nobility.
Precisely. The wealth and influence of town merchants, burghers or burgesses, and craft guilds grew significantly. They challenged the land-based power and status of the traditional nobility. Towns often negotiated or fought fiercely for charters from kings or lords, granting them degrees of self-governance, their own courts, and the right to collect their own taxes, further detaching them from direct feudal authority.
A new force in the medieval landscape.
A very powerful new force.
And this new urban wealth and identity were often displayed in impressive ways, like the building of magnificent cathedrals.
Cathedrals were perhaps the ultimate symbol of this era's ambition, faith, communal pride, and wealth. Funded often by wealthy merchants, guilds, bishops, townspeople contributing collectively, and sometimes nobles, these massive stone churches began to rise from the 12th century onwards, particularly famously in France with the Gothic style.
They weren't quick projects, were they?
Far from it. They took years, decades, sometimes generations to complete. Building Notre Dame in Paris, for example, spanned nearly 200 years. They required immense resources, stone quarried and transported, timber for scaffolding and roofs, and a vast array of skilled labor. Master masons, engineers, sculptors, carpenters, glassmakers.
And they became focal points.
Yes, major centers of pilgrimage, drawing visitors and further stimulating the growth and economy of the towns around them. They were the dominant feature of the skyline, visible for miles.
And they were designed with both religious purpose and practicality in mind, weren't they?
Yes, designed to accommodate large congregations, inspire awe, and facilitate worship. Acoustics were considered so the priest's voice and the choir could carry. The enormous bells, which could be heard for miles, served as a vital signal for the community, calling people to worship, marking time, warning of danger.
And the stained glass.
Yeah.
The sources emphasize its importance, more than just decoration.
Much more. The stained glass windows were absolutely central, especially in Gothic cathedrals, which had huge window spaces. They served as a visual Bible, the Bible of the poor, for a largely illiterate population. They depicted stories from scripture, saints' lives, and religious doctrine in vibrant, luminous images.
Like visual storytelling.
Exactly. The sources quote Abbot Suger of St. Denis near Paris in the 12th century, a key figure in the development of Gothic architecture. He described the beauty and richness of the glass, comparing them to precious stones and emphasizing their purpose: to fill the church with divine light, symbolizing God's presence, and to illuminate the minds of the worshippers, lifting them towards the heavens.
So we see this initial, supposedly stable system of three orders, anchored by feudalism and manorialism, starting to be dynamically reshaped by agricultural innovation, population growth, and the emergence of towns and trade. But the sources also describe a period of intense crisis in the 14th century that further destabilized things, a major shock to the system.
Yes, the early 14th century marked a significant turning point. The long period of expansion and relative prosperity began to slow and then reverse, and Europe was hit by a series of severe challenges. The sources call this the crisis of the 14th century. It was a perfect storm, really.
What factors contributed to this crisis? What went wrong?
Well, first, environmental factors played a significant role, particularly in Northern Europe. The climate deteriorated, as we mentioned, the onset of the Little Ice Age. Colder, wetter weather set in, with cold summers, bitter winters, and shorter growing seasons.
Which would hit farming hard.
Devastatingly hard, especially on marginal lands that had been brought into cultivation during the warmer period. It led to repeated harvest failures and sharply reduced crop yields. Devastating floods are also mentioned in some areas, ruining crops and land.
And this would have hit governments hard, too, financially.
Absolutely. Less agricultural output meant less surplus to tax, leading to decreased revenue for rulers just when resources were stretched thin by warfare, like the 100 Years' War, which started around this time.
Were there issues with land use practices themselves contributing? Had they pushed too hard?
Yes, the sources suggest that too. The period of rapid expansion in previous centuries had put a strain on resources. Overclearing of forests and overuse of pastures led to scarcity of timber and grazing land in some regions. In some areas, intensive plowing without sufficient manuring or proper rotation had simply exhausted the soil fertility.
A sustainability crisis, almost.
You could see it that way. A shortage of pasture meant fewer cattle could be supported, which meant less manure to fertilize the fields, creating a vicious cycle of declining yields. The system was hitting its limits.
All of this sounds like a recipe for disaster. Famine.
It led to severe and widespread famines, like the Great Famine of 1315-1317, which affected much of Northern Europe. It caused mass starvation and death on a horrifying scale. Livestock also died in huge numbers due to disease and lack of fodder. This brought the long period of population growth to a sudden, brutal halt even before the biggest shock hit.
Which, of course, was the Black Death, the plague.
The Black Death. It arrived in European ports, likely via trading ships from the Black Sea area, carrying infected rats and fleas between 1347 and 1350. It was a devastating pandemic of bubonic and possibly pneumonic plague that spread with terrifying speed and mortality across the continent.
The scale of the loss is almost hard to comprehend even now.
It's staggering. The sources estimate that between 20 and 40%, maybe even higher in some specific areas of the total population of Europe, died within just a few years. Whole villages were wiped out. Monasteries and convents where people lived in close communities were particularly decimated.
How did the population numbers change?
The overall population plummeted dramatically. From that peak of around 73 million in 1300, it fell to roughly 45 million by 1400. It took centuries for Europe's population to recover to pre-plague levels.
This must have had profound consequences far beyond the immediate human tragedy, economic and social chaos.
It caused a severe economic crisis and immense social upheaval. With so many people dead, there were critical labor shortages everywhere in the fields, in workshops, in towns. Who was left to till the fields, harvest the crops, weave the cloth, build the houses?
And what did that shortage do to prices and wages?
Well, with fewer people available to work, but still a need for essential goods and food, the price of manufactured items tended to rise due to scarcity, while the price of grain might have fallen initially due to lower demand from fewer mouths to feed, though this fluctuated. Crucially, the value of labor shot up.
So the survivors, particularly those who worked with their hands, found themselves in a new and unexpected position of power.
Exactly. The sudden, desperate demand for labor gave the reduced workforce unprecedented leverage. The sources give that striking example of English agricultural labor wages, which apparently increased by an astonishing 250% in the decades immediately after the Black Death. Lords, whose income relied on extracting labor and produce from peasants, suddenly found it very difficult and extremely expensive to find and keep workers. Peasants could demand much higher wages or better terms.
This directly challenged the economic foundation of the feudal system, didn't it? The lord-peasant relationship.
It struck right at its heart. The income of the landowning class, the nobility, and the church was hit hard. With agricultural prices perhaps declining slightly or stagnating due to lower demand from a smaller population and their labor costs soaring, lords scrambled to maintain their income and status.
How did they react? What did they try to do?
Their first instinct was often defensive. They tried to reduce the wages they paid, often through legislation like the Statute of Laborers in England, which tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. And crucially, they tried to reimpose or even increase the traditional feudal obligations and labor services owed by the peasants to tie them back to the land and extract labor without paying high cash wages.
And the peasants weren't about to give up the gains they were suddenly making, I imagine.
Not without a fight. Emboldened by the labor shortage and the new value placed on their work, peasants across Europe resisted these attempts by the lords. They demanded higher cash wages, lower rents, and crucially, the freedom to move and work for whoever offered the best terms. They wanted a reduction or commutation of feudal labor services into fixed cash payments.
And this resistance sometimes boiled over into outright rebellion, violent uprisings.
Yes, the sources mention significant peasant revolts erupting across Europe during this period of tension. Famous examples include the Jacquerie in France in 1358, a major uprising across England in 1381, the Peasants' Revolt, and early revolts like the one in Flanders in 1323. These weren't just about wages. They often included demands for an end to serfdom and greater social justice.
These revolts were often suppressed brutally, weren't they? The authorities didn't just give in.
No, they were usually crushed with ruthless violence. The authorities, the nobility, the monarchy, even wealthy townspeople who feared social disorder responded with military force to put down the uprisings. Leaders were executed, communities punished. The aim was clearly to terrorize the population back into submission and protect the landlord's traditional rights and economic position against the demands of the peasants.
But despite the suppression, did the revolts, combined with the underlying economic changes from the plague, fundamentally alter this system anyway in the long run?
The sources argue strongly that they did. While the rebellions themselves were ultimately defeated militarily, the fundamental economic reality of chronic labor scarcity couldn't be wished away by laws or violence. Coupled with the peasants' clear desire for freedom from traditional obligations and their demonstrated willingness to resist, it meant that the old feudal system of labor service began to slowly dissolve across much of Western Europe.
So caste became king.
Increasingly, yes. The money economy became more and more dominant. Lords found it more practical and often necessary to accept cash rents instead of labor services. They couldn't easily reimpose the old ways in the face of the changed economic landscape and the lingering threat of peasant flight or resistance. Serfdom gradually withered away in many areas.
So the crisis of the 14th century, driven by environmental factors, resource strain, and the devastating plague, significantly weakened the traditional feudal structure and the dominance of the land-based nobility. This seems to set the stage for the next big shift the sources discuss: the rise of stronger, more centralized states in the 15th and 16th centuries, the new monarchies.
Exactly. This period marks the emergence of rulers who were able to consolidate much greater power than their medieval predecessors, who often struggled against powerful, independent nobles.
The sources name some key figures: Louis XI in France, Maximilian in Austria, Henry II in England, Isabella and Ferdinand in Spain. What characterized these new monarchs? How did they build power?
Their strategy involved several key elements. They worked on creating permanent standing armies loyal directly to the crown, rather than relying solely on feudal levies from their vassals. They established more permanent professional bureaucracies staffed by trained administrators, often lawyers or educated clergy, sometimes even commoners, to manage the realm more effectively. And crucially, they developed national taxation systems to raise revenue directly, bypassing the fragmented feudal dues.
And this was essential for.
These developments were absolutely crucial, not just for imposing internal control over rebellious nobles or regions, but also for funding the state's ambitions, including warfare and, eventually, overseas exploration and expansion. You needed money and organization.
And this rise of monarchical power was directly linked to the decline of the old feudal system. They took advantage of the nobility's weakness.
Yes, there's a strong connection. The slow collapse of the feudal military system, where kings relied on the often unreliable military service of their vassals and their knights, combined with the economic shifts we discussed, the crisis hitting noble incomes, the rise of the money economy, created opportunities for ambitious monarchs to assert greater control over their subjects and overpower powerful, independent vassals.
And military technology played a vital role here, too, according to the sources. Cannons.
A very significant one. Rulers began to invest heavily in trained infantry, often equipped with pikes or bows, and, crucially, artillery cannons. The development and wider use of gunpowder and effective cannons, which monarchs could afford more easily than individual nobles, made the stone castles, which had been the impregnable power bases of the aristocratic class for centuries, suddenly vulnerable to siege.
So castles weren't the ultimate defense anymore.
Their dominance was eroding. This dramatically reduced the independent military power of the nobility relative to the king who controlled the big guns.
So monarchs used new tools, bureaucracy, taxation, military technology to centralize authority. What were their main goals?
Precisely. They focused on increasing state revenue through more efficient taxation, defending their borders more effectively against external threats, and asserting royal law and administration uniformly across the kingdom, pushing back against the traditional autonomy and judicial powers of the aristocracy and even powerful independent towns,
Right.
building a coherent state.
But this didn't happen without resistance, I assume. The nobles wouldn't just roll over.
Oh, there was considerable opposition, absolutely. The aristocracy didn't willingly give up their centuries-old privileges and independence. Towns often valued their hard-won freedoms and resisted royal encroachment. The sources mention rebellions in England during this period, like the Wars of the Roses, which was partly a dynastic struggle, but also involved powerful, noble factions. And then there were the long, disruptive religious conflicts in France, the wars of religion in the later 16th century, which were also deeply intertwined with struggles over central authority versus regional noble power.
How did the nobility adapt to this new landscape? Did they just disappear or become irrelevant?
No, their role changed fundamentally, but they certainly didn't disappear. They remained a powerful elite. The sources show a shift. Instead of being potentially rival power holders challenging the king, many nobles became integrated into the new state system. They often gained prominent positions in the monarch's court, in the growing administration, in the army, and in the navy. They became courtiers, diplomats, bureaucrats, and generals, relying on the king's favor, patronage, and salaries, rather than solely on their independent feudal land holdings and military power. Their power became more tied to service to the crown.
So the monarch was now clearly at the very top of this increasingly centralized structure.
Yes, they were positioned as the symbol of the state, the fount of justice and honor. But their power, while growing, wasn't absolute in most cases, not yet. It depended heavily on building networks of support among the elite, developing effective administrative systems, and crucially, having the financial resources to fund it all. Royal patronage, the skillful distribution of offices, land, titles, pensions, and other favors was absolutely essential for securing the loyalty of the nobility and the burgeoning bureaucracy.
And this is where the growing wealth of the merchant class we discussed earlier becomes relevant again, connecting to state power.
Absolutely. Merchants and bankers, with their access to liquid wealth, cash, gained significant influence by lending large sums of money to monarchs. Kings needed cash to pay for armies, officials, courts, wars. This financial integration provided the monarchs with the capital needed, further blurring the lines between economic power held by merchants and state power wielded by the monarch. They became partners, in a sense.
The sources draw an interesting contrast between the political paths taken by France and England during this period regarding representative bodies at the States General and Parliament.
This is a key distinction highlighted with long-term consequences. France had the Estates General, a body representing the three traditional orders: clergy, first estate, nobility, second estate, and the third estate, everyone else effectively dominated by urban representatives. England had Parliament, which had evolved into two houses: the House of Lords, senior clergy and hereditary nobles, and the House of Commons, elected representatives from towns and rural counties, mostly knights and prosperous landowners.
And the difference in how these bodies were used had long-term consequences for their political development.
Significant ones, yes. In England, Parliament, particularly the Commons, was called relatively regularly by monarchs needing to raise taxes. Its power and influence grew over time, especially after the struggles of the 17th century, like the Civil War and the Glorious Revolution of 1689, leading towards a system with a balance of power between the monarch and Parliament.
And France.
In France, however, powerful monarchs found ways to raise revenue without relying so heavily on the Estates General. As a result, it was not summoned at all for very long periods, for instance, not between 1614 and 1789. This meant there was no similar institutional check on the growth of royal absolutism. This contributed to France following a different political trajectory, eventually leading to revolution and a republic, while England evolved into a constitutional parliamentary monarchy.
That's a fascinating divergence. So we've traced how internal European factors, agricultural revolution, urban growth, devastating crisis, state centralization fundamentally altered the medieval world built on the three orders. And all of this was happening in a world that was increasingly interconnected, as you said at the start.
Which brings us back nicely to that global timeline the sources provide, particularly for the period 1300 to 1700. The internal European changes, especially the economic dynamism driven by towns and trade, and the enhanced financial and organizational capacity of the stronger states were directly linked to Europe's rapidly expanding interactions with the rest of the world. One fueled the other.
The sources mention changing attitudes concerning the value of life during this period, linking it to commercial expansion and the Renaissance. What's the connection there?
Well, the Renaissance, which flourished roughly from the 14th to the 17th century, was a period of intense cultural and intellectual change in Europe, starting in Italy. Fueled by wealth, often generated by that expanding trade and banking, wealthy patrons, merchants, popes, princes supported a dazzling flourishing of art, literature, architecture, and scholarship.
What defined it intellectually?
There was a renewed interest in classical Greek and Roman ideas and culture, humanism, but the sources also note a significant interest in Islamic art, science, and literature, highlighting the cross-cultural fertilization that was occurring. This period saw a shift towards humanism, focusing more on human potential, achievement, and the wonders of the earthly world, not solely on the divine afterlife. This intellectual ferment fostered curiosity, individualism, and a desire to explore and understand the world.
And that desire to explore led directly to the great voyages of discovery.
It certainly contributed to the mindset, yes. Starting seriously in the late 15th century, initially spearheaded by Portugal and Spain, these voyages were driven by a complex mix of motives. Seeking new sea routes to the lucrative spice markets of Asia, to bypass existing Venetian and Ottoman intermediaries, searching for gold and other resources, spreading Christianity, national rivalry, and sheer curiosity.
Where did they go?
They explored the coasts of Africa, rounded the Cape of Good Hope to reach India. Vasco da Gama famously encountered the Americas, Columbus, though he thought he'd reached Asia, circumnavigated the globe, Magellan's expedition, and later voyages extended exploration to the Arctic, the Pacific, Australia, searching for new lands and routes.
And Europeans weren't just imposing themselves, they were also learning from the peoples they encountered, according to the sources.
Yes, the sources highlight that Europeans were at times cautious observers interested in learning. They certainly drew on the existing geographical knowledge of Arab scholars like al-Idrisi. They encountered and wrote about sophisticated societies and scholars in Africa, like Leo Africanus. And Jesuit missionaries, particularly in places like China and Japan, sent back detailed observations of unfamiliar cultures, technologies, and philosophies.
But these encounters weren't always marked by curiosity or mutual respect, were they? The sources mention a darker side.
Unfortunately, no, far from it. The sources point out that while curiosity existed, European interaction was very often characterized by the use of force, the imposition of trade monopolies through violence, like the Portuguese tactics in the Indian Ocean, using naval gunnery to dominate trade in places like Calicut after Vasco da Gama arrived in 1498, exploitation of resources, and an attitude that was frequently one of profound cultural and religious superiority,
Leading to abuse.
often leading to abusive behavior, enslavement, and conquest. The sources even note the complex and sometimes contradictory position of the church, which on one hand encouraged study of other cultures for missionary purposes, but also sometimes sanctioned or encouraged hostility and violence towards non-Christians deemed infidels or pagans.
The sources also give us perspectives from the non-European side of these encounters, which is crucial. How did others see the Europeans?
This is really important for a balanced view, and the sources try to include this. Some accounts from other parts of the world viewed the early European arrivals critically, sometimes with disdain. They are described as hasty traders, perhaps lacking refinement, or driven primarily by greed for gold and spices.
What about Japan?
The Japanese, while initially intrigued in adopting European firearms technology quite effectively, reportedly came to see Europeans as potentially disruptive, hardy perhaps, but ultimately making relatively small positive contributions to their sophisticated society compared to the risks they posed, leading to Japan largely closing itself off for a long period.
And the exchange of technology and biology had complex and often devastating consequences. You mentioned disease earlier.
Hugely consequential. Europeans learned things like the formula for gunpowder from China, though developed cannons effectively themselves, and adopted technologies like the compass. They learned about new crops from the Americas, potatoes, maize, tomatoes, which eventually transformed European agriculture and diets. Europeans introduced firearms, which changed warfare globally. They introduced horses to the Americas, transforming plains cultures. But perhaps the most catastrophic exchange was the unintended one. The introduction of European diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza to the Americas and Pacific Islands. Native populations had absolutely no prior exposure or immunity,
Leading to?
leading to horrific demographic collapses. The sources note population declines estimated at over 90% in some areas of the Americas by the end of the 16th century, a biological catastrophe that facilitated European conquest and colonization.
So looking at that entire period from 1300 to 1700 globally, it's a time of simultaneous, interconnected, and often disruptive change happening everywhere, not just in Europe.
Absolutely. That summary timeline, the sources likely include, vividly reinforces just how much was happening concurrently across the world. While Europe was grappling with the plague, the Hundred Years' War, peasant revolts, the invention of the printing press, the Renaissance with figures like Leonardo and Michelangelo, and scientific breakthroughs from Copernicus challenging the old cosmic order to Harvey discovering blood circulation.
What was happening elsewhere?
Elsewhere, you had major empires like the Songhai in West Africa, the Ming Dynasty in China undertaking huge naval expeditions initially, the Ottoman Empire reaching its zenith, the Mughal Empire rising in India. You had the rise of powerful trading companies like the Dutch and English East India companies, monumental voyages of exploration by figures like Magellan, Cook, and Tasman, charting the globe, the brutal conquest of vast empires like the Aztec and Inca by small Spanish forces, and the beginnings of European colonization and the transatlantic slave trade in the Americas and elsewhere. It's a truly global transformation.
What's the overarching insight we can draw from these sources about this whole period, connecting the European narrative of changing traditions and orders with the global one?
I think the era is defined by unprecedented transformation and accelerating global interconnection. We see fundamental changes in the way people lived and worked in Europe because of shifts in agriculture, urban growth, and new technologies. We see a constant intensifying contact and exchange between continents of ideas, inventions, goods, religions, and unfortunately, also conflict, exploitation, and disease. And we see the massive movement of people, often displaced from their homes, migrating or forced into enslavement on a scale never seen before. The lives of people across the entire globe were irrevocably transformed by the forces set in motion during this complex and often brutal period.
It's been a fascinating deep dive into a period that, from a distance, can seem slow and static, locked into those three orders, but is revealed by these sources to be incredibly dynamic, turbulent, and complex. We started with that seemingly fixed idea and saw how external pressures like climate shifts and the devastating Black Death, combined with internal developments like new technologies, the growth of towns with their own power structures, and the relentless drive for political centralization by monarchs, didn't just modify that old structure, but fundamentally challenged and began to dismantle it.
It's that complex interplay, isn't it? How agricultural abundance fueled population growth and opened up new possibilities beyond subsistence. How towns created entirely new centers of wealth, innovation, and political power distinct from the old feudal order. How a terrible crisis like the Black Death, paradoxically, empowered those ordinary workers who survived by making their labor scarce and invaluable. And how ambitious monarchs skillfully leveraged these shifts, the weakening nobility, the new wealth, the new military tech to build stronger, more organized states.
States which, in turn, had the capacity and the drive to project their power outwards, fueling that next era of global exploration, competition, and interaction.
Precisely. The internal changes fueled the external expansion, and the external interactions then fed back into further changes within Europe, a constant loop.
And that leaves us with a thought to carry forward, perhaps. These sources show us so clearly that even social systems that seem utterly rigid and divinely ordained, like the medieval three orders, are constantly being shaped and reshaped. They're shaped by forces seemingly beyond immediate human control, like pandemics or climate shifts, but also crucially by human innovation, ambition, and resistance.
Whether that's someone developing a better plow or harness, merchants building new trade networks, townspeople demanding charters, peasants resisting unfair obligations, artists creating new visions, or rulers consolidating power. Human actions constantly reshape the structures.
So maybe we can ask ourselves, consider how the major global challenges we face today, things like climate change, pandemics, rapid technological shifts like AI, economic inequality, how might these be fundamentally reshaping our own social structures, our economies, the balance of power around us, in ways that we are only just beginning to grasp?
It's very much like the people living through the profound crisis of the 14th century must have experienced their world changing irrevocably around them without fully understanding the long-term consequences.
What seemingly fixed traditions or structures in our own time might actually be on the cusp of changing in ways we can't yet fully predict. Something to think about after this deep dive.